Music has always been a big part of Christianity, and especially Lutheranism ever since the Reformation. If I were to ask Lutherans to name some Lutheran composers, Martin Luther himself would probably be high on that list. In the introduction episode to this podcast, I remarked how Lutheran composers like Bach are still very popular centuries after their deaths. Did you know that Bach still gets over 7 million monthly listeners on Spotify? Another Lutheran composer who falls on that timeline between Luther and Bach was rather popular in his own day, and he still registers a respectable 800,000 plus listeners on Spotify. Today we'll talk about that author, that composer, Michael Praetorius. And today, February 15th, just so happens to be the 400th anniversary of his death. Today's guest needs no new introduction. Today we get to welcome again Pastor Nathaniel Biebert, who joined us to discuss his research book on Johannes Streeter. You can find that discussion in episode 2 of the Lutheran History Podcast. So Pastor Biebert, thank you for joining us. And are there any new developments on your project since we last spoke?
Yeah, it's great to be on again. Thanks for having me again. And yes, as of the middle of December, it's titled Sacred Storytelling. Sacred Storytelling went into production with Whip and Stock Publishers under their Resource Publications imprint. And you can pick it up if you so choose through Whip and Stock's customer service department. So, yep, it's available for purchase now.
Well, excellent. I hope many people take a look at that and order a copy. Now, today we'll focus on an article that you prepared that was titled The Purpose, Effect, and Value of Choral Church Music. And it's really primarily a translation project you've worked on, but you've also written a book about Michael Praetorius, or translated a book and edited a book called Heaven is My Fatherland. So I hope we can talk about that sometime in the future. But before we get into the content of your article, can you tell us briefly who was Michael Praetorius and how did he affect Lutheranism?
Yeah, so Michael Praetorius was try to get everything that he was here. He was a musician, a composer, a director, and a music theorist, and an organ consultant who flourished in the early 1600s, predominantly in Wolfenbüttel and then in Dresden in Germany, but he had an influence that was wider than that. He is probably best known for popularizing a style of choral church music in German territories known as Venetian polychorality. And as that name suggests, both parts of the name suggest, it originated in Venice, and it involves multiple choirs. The idea is that you have multiple choirs in the same singing space, but they are separately positioned, and they sort of sing back and forth to each other and play off of each other. And then sometimes at high points in the composition, join in together for this very rich and robust surround sound type feel to it. And Praetorius definitely seized on that and employed that and popularized that. But he also was known for writing settings that were much simpler, but no less beautiful, and probably the most or the point of contact that the average listener to your podcast or average Lutheran is going to have with Michael Praetorius. They might not even know about it, but whenever they sing the hymn, Behold, a branch is growing, which is sometimes also translated, Lo, how a rose ere blooming, far and away the most common setting of that hymn is Michael Praetorius' setting. He didn't write the tune to it, but he set it to a simple 4-part setting, and that is far and away the most often used setting of that hymn to this day. So his impact comes to us in some small ways. It comes to us in big ways if we're willing to dig into the research a little bit more and look into his life a little bit more. As far as his impact in his own day, it kind of was limited to his life because by the time he died, the 30 Years' War had already begun. And because of the ravages of that war, especially his more complex musical settings just couldn't be performed because people didn't have those kinds of ensembles anymore during the ravages of the 30 Years' War. And by the time the 30 Years' War moved on, or was over, musical tastes and trends had moved on. So he had a profound impact during his life, but it died almost immediately after he died. And then his impact didn't really get resurrected until people started resurrecting his music in the 1800s. And then especially in the early 1900s, there was a revival of interest in his life and in his work, which still continues to one extent or another to this day.
Now, you also mentioned that he had some kind of connection with Martin Luther, not a personal during his lifetime kind of connection, but what was that? How could he link himself to Luther directly?
Yeah, so he really couldn't link himself to Luther directly, but his father, Michael Schultheis, I should probably explain why his father has a different last name than he does. He was no doubt baptized Michael Schultheis, just like his father, who was also named Michael. But it was common in that day that once you began a university education, you would take a Latin last name that corresponded to your German last name. And since Schultheis was the German word for a magistrate or a village judge, he took a word, Praetorius, which means magistrate related or like a magistrate, as his last name, like his two older brothers did, who also studied at the university before him. So anyway, his father, Michael Schultheis, studied under Luther at the University of Wittenberg, and actually got one of his scholarships to study there because of Luther's own recommendation. And then also his maternal grandfather was a man by the name of Gabriel Zwilling. And he's not real familiar except generally to Luther scholars, but he was kind of a feisty firebrand preacher associate of Luther's and a close friend of Luther's as well. So both through his mother's side and through his father's side, he had connections to Martin Luther.
So yeah, he's kind of the second or maybe third generation after Luther himself. So kind of within living memory, at least of his relatives.
Right.
This gives our listeners who are at least familiar probably with Luther's life a little bit after that, but still not too far.
Yeah. Yeah. So Luther died in 1546 and Praetorius was born in 1571.
Yeah. So how was Praetorius, his own father, as you mentioned, his name change? How is he connected to other events and developments in Lutheran history?
So let me start by going to the Book of Concord. If you're a confessional Lutheran, you subscribe to the Book of Concord of 1580. And the last of the confessions that's included in that book is the Formula of Concord of 1577. And the Formula of Concord was written and is named what it is because that's what the Lutherans so desperately needed at the time it was written, was concord and unity. Because almost from the moment Luther died in 1546, all sorts of controversies and arguments and discussions about different doctrinal topics sprang up in the Lutheran Church. And basically, all the Formula of Concord does is go through and answer each one of those controversies that came up and makes an effort to resolve it among the Lutherans and the various parties involved. And Michael Schultheis, Michael Praetorius' father, was personally involved in two of those controversies. First of all, the adiaphoristic controversy, which is kind of a fancy word, but adiaphora has to do with things that are neither commanded nor forbidden in Scripture. And so the adiaphoristic controversy was, how do you deal with those things, especially when your confession of faith is on the line? In a highly emotional situation and in a situation that calls for a clear doctrinal confession. So he got involved in that controversy. And then after that, he got involved in the synergistic controversy, which was a controversy about the role of free will, the human will in man's salvation, or the lack thereof, the lack of its role in human salvation. And the positions that Michael Schultheis took in those controversies ultimately ended up being vindicated in the Formula of Concord. But because of the various to and fro and the emotional waves of the situation when it was happening, he got kicked out of two different pastoral positions. He got kicked out of his position as deacon in Torgau when he was actually working alongside what would be Michael Praetorius' maternal grandfather, Gabriel Zwilling. He was his deacon. And he got kicked out of that position. And then he also got kicked out of his pastoral position in the city of Kreuzberg an der Werra, which is not too far away from Eisenach and the Wartburg Castle in Thuringia. And he actually got kicked out of that position twice. And it was very unfortunate for him. It was very unfortunate for his people too, because his people in Kreuzberg loved him. They thought he was a wonderful preacher and teacher, and they loved the fact that he had an exemplary Christian life, and they were constantly protesting the fact that he had to keep leaving them because he was getting kicked out by the territorial rulers and whatnot. But the situation was largely out of their hands.
Yeah, that's something. It's a cultural and temporal transition we have to make to understand. You couldn't just pick your pastor. Your government told you who your pastor was going to be or couldn't be.
And they maybe had on paper the right of approval or something like that, but yeah, it was largely driven by the territorial rulers and maybe a commission that he organized.
Yeah, and it kind of applies with musicians as well, at least if they have some kind of official position. Same thing, where and we kind of see that in Praetorius's life as well. So you mentioned that Praetorius began his studies to become a pastor, like his many of his family members had been, but he later switched to pursue a career in music. How did he employ his musical gifts in the service of others?
So one way that he did it is simply that he was intentional about it. And what I mean by that is anyone who composes good music is by that very fact serving others, but they might not be doing it intentionally. Praetorius was very intentional about it. And you can tell that from the dedicatory epistles or prefaces to his works, where he makes it very clear, like, I want to serve my fellow man by providing these pieces. So that would be one way that he did it. Another way is that he didn't really forget the little guys, so to speak. The first series of works that he published was called The Muses of Zion. And the first 4 installments of that series had pretty complex settings for 8 parts, 9 parts, 12 parts, divided among multiple choirs. So you might have 2 choirs of 4 parts each, or 3 choirs of 4 parts each, adding up to 12 parts, or something like that. But then when he was getting ready to publish his 5th through 9th installments, and he says this explicitly in a couple of his prefaces, he deliberately made an attempt to remember that in these little villages and market towns and things like that had much smaller churches, they wouldn't have had choirs and musicians that were available to perform these very complex pieces. So for those later volumes, for installments 5 through 9, he had settings that were for 2 parts or 3 parts and up to 7 parts at the most. And so those parts were much more workable for smaller choirs. And that way they too could benefit from his musical gifts that God had given him. Just on a personal note, we have a 12-member choir at our church right now, and we're currently in the process of rehearsing a 3-part setting by Praetorius of A Mighty Fortress. And it's still requiring some work on our parts, but it's doable. And in spite of the fact that it only has 3 parts, it still has a very rich and robust harmony about it. So still bearing fruit to this day.
So kind of a follow-up question on that, where can people find music that's still available for our small church choirs?
Yeah, there might be some stuff available via the various music publishing avenues. They certainly will publish Praetorius settings. I don't know how much of his simpler settings are available through those avenues. Our church might have a little bit of an advantage with having a pastor that does some Praetorius research and knows where to find some of these settings. Ultimately, all of his works are found in what's called the Gesamtausgabe of his works, which means the complete edition of his works. But usually that can only be found in university libraries as a hard copy. I know Martin Luther College also has a set of that. But otherwise, it is available on, I believe it's imslp.org. You can view those volumes, at least for research purposes, and see his settings. And so if you're able to find an English translation equivalent like A Mighty Fortress Is Our God, you can use his music and combine it with the English lyrics and sing some of those settings.
So it takes a little bit of work and research maybe to make Make it practical.
It really should be more available than it is, but maybe this podcast will be the catalyst.
Yeah, or if you don't have, a dozen other projects you're working on, maybe you could produce that for us. No, that's a good advice for someone who's musically inclined to make that more available. I'm intrigued by that. So as you went through Praetorius's own discussion about music, as he's talking about music itself, but could you put some of that into your own words? How did he summarize the purpose of choral church music?
So I would basically say he talks about it not only in the chapters that I translated for the article you're talking about, but he does talk about that in a number of his other works as well. It's an important question to him. What is the purpose of choral church music? And I would say that it kind of boils down to three things. First of all, choral church music adds to the joy of the proclamation of the gospel and the joy of our praise of God. So, for instance, to put it in terms that concrete terms that we can relate to today, it's one thing to say as part of a responsive prayer after the sermon, "We praise you, O Lord." But then it's another thing to end an Easter service by singing "Jesus Christ is risen today," or singing at the end of a Christmas service, "Now sing we, now rejoice." There's a heightened sense of joy with those things, and Praetorius recognized that. Same thing with adding to the joy of the proclamation of the gospel. It's one thing, and it's a very important thing for a pastor to preach from the pulpit that we are saved by God's grace alone through faith in Jesus Christ alone. But then that joy is taken to a whole new level when it's followed up with a robust singing of salvation unto us has come. So Praetorius seized on that. And that's what I would say the first purpose that he talks about is for choral church music. The second purpose is that he says that it more easily plants the true doctrine of the triune God into human hearts that are naturally not inclined to take it in, basically. So he would, to use a more recent pop culture reference, at least much more recent than Praetorius. Praetorius would agree wholeheartedly with Mary Poppins that a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine to go down. But he would apply that to music and God's word. God's word is the medicine that we all need. And music is the sugar that helps it to go down more smoothly. I think of this a lot when I'm watching performances of Bach's sacred music on YouTube or something like that. And if I dare scroll down to the comments, which is not often the best practice when watching any YouTube video, but sometimes you see some interesting comments beneath Bach music videos. And if it's, a cantata or his St. Matthew Passion, you'll actually see comments from time to time like, "Bach's music almost makes me want to believe," or "I'm a believer as long as I'm listening to Bach's music." So in other words, Christian doctrine is repulsive to them otherwise, or they don't care for it otherwise, but they can't get enough of it when it's combined with this fitting and beautiful music. And Praetorius recognized that too. So that would be the second purpose. And the third purpose is then simply rehearsal. Praetorius would say, if we're going to be participating in infinitely more glorious praise of Jesus Christ in his presence, together with all the saints and angels in heaven, then why wouldn't we already want to prepare for that now? And there's even a few places where he might even say, to paraphrase what he says there, if you're not interested in choral music here on earth, then are you actually planning to go to heaven? So those would be the three main purposes. He talks about other branch off purposes of that, I would say as well. Maybe the one purpose that should be mentioned here is he does talk about music's purpose for stirring of the emotions. But he wouldn't talk about that the same way that we tend to talk about that today. For instance, I was watching a documentary the other day on which I saw country singer Vince Gill basically say that good music makes you feel something. And Praetorius would say, yes, I agree with that, but he would say that not all emotional impact is good. He would distinguish between good and godly and fitting emotions of the spirit or of the new man, and foul and ungodly and unfitting emotions of the flesh, which are bad emotional experiences to have. And then he would also say that we shouldn't just always be looking to be made happy by music. He would say that music's emotional expression should match the varied emotions that the Bible wants us to feel. So, for instance, there's paragraphs and passages that talk about our sinfulness and are trying to work contrition in us and sadness over our sinfulness in us. So there should be music to match that makes us feel even more sad, makes us realize just how sad our sins should make us feel, and what the harm that they've done to us, or that reflects the hardships that we have to experience as Christians carrying the cross. And then there should be more gentle, lilting music to match the parts of the Bible that talk about Jesus' promises and comforting promises to us in the midst of our hardships. And then there should also be joyful music that makes us feel all the more happy when we consider when we're giving thanks to God for his forgiveness or for eternal life and stuff like that. So it's more nuanced and more complex than just simply music should make you feel something. It should match the biblical expressions, the variety of biblical expressions that are found in God's word.
Thanks for sharing that. And I'm not much of a Lutheran music scholar, as many other people could claim to be, much more than I. But I have noticed when I kind of focus on Bach, which I guess is the only guy I've really looked at any length, it seems very similar to this. And I always kind of thought, oh, Bach is great. He's so unique. But he's coming 150 years after this. And I guess my perception has shifted a bit. Maybe this was just part of Lutheran musical philosophy tradition that has been carried on for centuries, and Bach was just another guy who's good at talking this way, and not so much an original thinker, but more of a
perfecting what was already there.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, I think. So yeah, thank you for sharing this, because this has really helped me understand maybe the depth and the richness of the Lutheran musical tradition even more so. So you've stated that Praetorius possessed, quote, an endless well of curiosity, a voracious hunger for knowledge, and an equal thirst for a sense of Christian identity. But where did his pursuit of knowledge and identity lead him? How did it impact his life, his outlook, and his work?
So where it led him ultimately was into this huge side research project that he voluntarily undertook, which he planned to bring out in a 4-volume musical compendium that had the title Syntagma Musicum, which means just that, musical compendium. Scholars will often talk about his syntagma. So he wanted to produce this 4-volume syntagma, and in the first volume, he planned to outline the history and the development of sacred and secular music. In the second volume, he wanted to catalog and describe in detail all of the various instruments, including not just instruments that would be used customarily for church, but he also talked about how he was going to briefly cover barbarian instruments, and even in light of Columbus's discovery not too far before that, instruments used among the use of the Native Americans over here in this continent as well. But he especially focuses on the pipe organ and devotes the most attention to that in that second volume. And the third volume, he wanted to cover all of musical terminology and performance practice and new musical trends taking place in Italy. And then in the fourth volume, he wanted to provide a comprehensive composition manual. And only the first 3 of those volumes have come down to us. There is evidence that he also completed the fourth, and that would be fascinating. But if that manuscript is around somewhere, no one has found out where it is yet. So maybe someone will pull out the wrong book someday and discover this manuscript, or find it hidden somewhere else. I don't know. But anyway, we have the first 3 volumes. And so those are the ones that scholars will typically study as far as Praetorius as a music theorist goes. As far as how it impacted then his life and his outlook and things like that, first of all, I would just say listen to his music to see how it influenced him, how that study influenced him, especially his later music after he had finished his work on this series. At his funeral, Pastor Peter Tuckerman quoted the old German proverb, the work proves the craftsman. And so you can tell that with Praetorius's music. If a musician has a firm conviction and a clear outlook and a solid sense of Christian identity, you're going to hear it in his music. And you hear it regularly in Praetorius's music. So that would be the impact on the positive side. On the negative side, Praetorius was busy enough as it is, and now he's taking on this huge side project as well. And it seems like it pretty much helped to run him into the ground and may have even contributed to his premature death at age 49. He had a lot of irons in the fire, and not all of that was because of responsibilities given to him by others. Some of it was just stuff that he took up on himself out of his own endless well of curiosity. So it wasn't all positive impact from that, but certainly what has come down to us is of extraordinary benefit to us today.
So you're saying there is such a thing as too much research, and it might not be good for you.
Yeah, it's hard to say that, though, isn't it? Because it's so fun.
It's kind of a scary conclusion you're making for this audience. Yeah. So you've mentioned all this work that he's done, and kind of the thing is, if you're writing for a scholarly audience, you're going to be writing in Latin at this time. And his works, unless they've been translated, aren't going to be very useful to most people, because most people don't understand Latin. So you've included a translation of some of his work in Heaven is My Fatherland, and now you've done a little bit more for this article that we're discussing. But what made you kind of pursue these multiple projects with Praetorius's writings? Why do you think they're still valuable and important to others?
Oh, well, they're valuable. Well, let me start by saying this. Even secular music scholars today recognize the value of the second two volumes of his Syntagma. And those are the volumes that are more widely available in English. And I don't know, just maybe if there's a misunderstanding here, only the first volume he wrote in Latin. The second and the third volume, and presumably the fourth as well, he did write in German.
Okay.
So that's probably one of the reasons that the second two volumes have been translated and are more widely available in English. And like I said, even secular scholars will acknowledge the tremendous value of those, because he's describing like the exact shape and the exact size of all of the instruments that are available and how to play them, and how different kinds of performance practices and styles and techniques and things like that. And so this is very, very popular in the classical music scene today, where period correct performance practice is kind of a big thing in some circles. And you almost can't do that without knowledge of Praetorius's work. Because even though he was kind of hoping his work would kind of be the first and that others would come after him and develop it more, he kind of ended up being the only one to do a musical compendium like this, at least in his day and age. And so tremendously valuable. It's the first volume that has received the least attention, and not only because it's in Latin, that probably is the main reason, just because there's less scholars in Latin than there are in German. But also, I have a feeling it's because it is the most religious of the three volumes, and secular music scholars aren't as interested in that. But it's kind of too bad, because he really does set the whole foundation for music in that volume. Its reason for being, to use a phrase that philosophers like to use, is really set down in that volume. And the first half is all about sacred music, and the second half is all about secular music. And the first half has been translated for a dissertation back in the late 1970s, but good luck getting a hold of it. I mean, you basically kind of have to have insider university access to be able to maybe view it electronically somewhere. And then you would have to, if you wanted a hard copy, you'd have to like single-handedly, print out, copy and paste each sheet or something and print each sheet out individually as you're viewing it. That's kind of what I had to do in my research to get a hold of the English translation. So it's just not widely available. And the translation leaves something to be desired on top of that. So that's why one of the reasons why I undertook to retranslate 3 of the chapters from that portion. And then in the second half, as you mentioned, I did translate the preface to that half and included it in an appendix for Heaven is My Fatherland. But that half itself is still in Latin and only in Latin. And man, wouldn't it be fascinating to have to read what a Christian scholar of the type that Praetorius is, what he has to say about the origin and the development and the practice of secular music from the beginning. To me, that would just be fascinating. And everything that I've encountered that he writes in the first half is certainly fascinating. Not all the facts that he shares are accurate, but as far as getting a Christian perspective on music, you can't hardly beat it.
I'm just curious, maybe off the top of your head, what are some of the things he doesn't get right?
For instance, and I guess I don't know that I can cite on the spot here some facts that he gets wrong. But the thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is that, for instance, when he's talking about the Psalms of Ascents and what that was, he basically just cites every opinion on the earth that he could find in books, and some of them are conflicting with each other, and he doesn't really leave you with any sort of sense of where you should lean one way or the other as far as what this means, things like that. So in some ways, he is truly, I mean, it's a compendium, so he is kind of truly just compiling and not necessarily reading it critically and making sense of anything, and he maybe just realized he wasn't qualified to do that in some cases. But then other cases, in the way that he might interpret a Hebrew phrase here or there, doesn't seem that it holds up to scrutiny too much. But just as far as, talking about music from a scriptural and spiritual point of view, I think that's where he really shines.
So I think we've learned to have a lot of respect for Praetorius, for all the work that he's done and his outlook and diligence, and not only his musical talent. And I've noticed his life maybe gives a value lesson for people today too. Some people assume that anyone who wants to pursue theology, you got to be a pastor. But how is Praetorius a good example of taking theological pursuits in another fruitful direction?
Yeah. I myself have a brother who studied for the pastoral ministry up through college. He finished college and got the degree he needed that he could have continued studying for the pastoral ministry. He didn't. He got his degree and decided to drop out from that study and become a mechanic. Some people might say that was a waste, but he makes a great councilman at his church. And I'm sure that he approaches his work from a much different perspective than he would have otherwise if he had not received that theological education. And same thing with Praetorius. He himself often expressed regrets that he didn't become a pastor, but it's precisely that theological education that he has and that pastor's head and heart that he has in many cases that gives his music such a theological depth and richness to it. So I'm definitely not saying that anyone pursuing any career whatsoever definitely should study for the pastoral ministry first before going into those careers. But I also, if someone did study for the pastoral ministry first and then decided not to become a pastor and entered any other vocation, I would definitely not say that was a waste of time, because it certainly does bring a theological richness and depth to your other endeavors when you have that background.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. So now, as you've really looked at his own research, what can we learn from Praetorius about the worship of history styles in the past? You mentioned he tried to kind of cover everything, but what stands out?
Yeah, what stands out? That's a better question.
Yeah.
I don't know that I could answer that question to anyone's satisfaction with my studies into it, be they what they may. But I will say this. Praetorius found kind of the prototypes for Venetian polychorality, which I mentioned before. He found those prototypes in the Psalms, and I think that is actually almost indisputable. he cites a number of psalms that he says it's clear in these psalms that there were multiple choirs, that this was written for multiple choirs to sing back and forth with each other. And of all the psalms that he cites, it's really hard to argue with any of them. Psalm 104, for instance, which is one of the ones that he cites, you can't really make sense out of the original Hebrew of that psalm unless you view it as at least two choirs singing back and forth to each other, alternating lines with each other. So even though I'm sure that the arrangements and the performance styles between the Levites and David's and Solomon's day and in Praetorius's day, I'm sure they were much different as far as their framing and their clothing, so to speak. There is definitely a connection there and a lot in common there that Praetorius really did seize on in making use of Venetian polychorality.
Right. And then what stands out about his conclusions about worship in his own day, kind of his contemporary worship outlook?
Yeah, so that's very interesting to me, just because, and maybe this is just my take, I'm not really any sort of serious musician myself, but I always kind of get the impression for serious musicians, in my experience, in my lifetime, that they kind of wish, they're kind of never satisfied. Like they wish things were better. They wish the music scene was better at their church or in their church body at large, or whatever the case might be. Praetorius in general, and his contemporaries too, who quote him, seem to be pretty happy with the way music, the state of music in the Lutheran Church and in German territories at the time that Praetorius lived. There's a very interesting preface that a contemporary of Praetorius wrote. He wrote it in 1620, and Praetorius died the following year, but he was writing some music, and he wrote this preface to it, and he actually quotes Praetorius at the beginning of it, which kind of shows you just kind of the reputation that he had at the time. But then he goes on to talk about like what the state of music was like in Germany at that time, and it's actually fascinating. He says that even in the small towns and villages, that there was hardly a one that you could find, especially in Thuringia, he said. So the area of Kreuzberg and Eisenach and cities like that, especially in Thuringia, there was hardly even a little market town, he said, where you couldn't find flourishing church music, both vocally and instrumentally. He said even in churches that didn't have any pipe organ, you could still find 5 or 6 people who could play the violin well. And wow, I mean, that's pretty incredible. Praetorius himself said that he thought that the pipe organ could not really be advanced any more than it was in his day. He thought it had reached such a state of development and perfection that there really couldn't be too much more to take place to make it any better than it already was. So there really was this sense that, and maybe it was just, after all of the fighting that had taken place in the decades following Luther's death, and then finally peace had been made in 1580, and now Lutherans were just getting about living out that peace and, living out their Lutheran doctrine and applying their Lutheran doctrine to all the areas of life, including their music. And so you kind of have this period of peace and this period of flourishing that happens between 1580 and the 30 Years' War. And Praetorius is coming at the very end of that. So he definitely appreciated the music that was around in his day. He certainly thought it could continue to progress yet, but he had a very high opinion of what it was like in his own day.
So now we did past, then we did his own past, so kind of contemporary. But what about what do you think Praetorius might say for us in this present and the future from his perspective?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, we can certainly do a much better job of appreciating and promoting the arts today, just in general, visual arts as well as musical arts. My sense is that most of the churches in our circles, you have 1 or 2 musicians, and they're usually a keyboardist or an organist or something like that. And whose fault is that? I ask myself, are we doing as good a job as we can of promoting musicians, and then not just encouraging young people who seem like they could be gifted in that regard, but then actually supporting them, supporting them in that endeavor and making use of other instruments to the glory of God. As good as that would be, I think we also, what Praetorius would also help us do today, you can't really read Praetorius talking about the pipe organ without gaining a new and fresh appreciation for it when he talks about its development, and when he talks about it from his perspective as an organ player and as an organ consultant who knows the inner and outer workings of it. I think we kind of have maybe lost a little bit of appreciation for the instrument, maybe in large part because it's such an expensive one to build or an expensive one to maintain. But after reading Praetorius, you would probably second guess the wisdom of that trend of maybe gradually phasing out the pipe organ, just the way that he describes it. I mean, what do you got? You basically got wind passing through metal and wood. So as I remember one teacher explaining it to me, you have ore from beneath the earth, wood from upon the earth, and air from above the earth, all combining, from God's creation in this wonderful mechanism to aid God's people in God's praise. And one of the things that Praetorius praises about the organ is its genuine natural sound. And that phrase really strikes me too, not just as far as appreciating the organ more, but then just thinking about music in general. I think because of the pop music culture that we're raised in and the commercial culture that we're raised in, the commercials on television, namely, or on YouTube, I think our tastes are kind of almost warped from little on, so that we almost appreciate electronic artificial sounds or have a preference for them more than for this genuine natural sound that Praetorius is striving for. And there's just something to be said for that. Let's say you have a pipe organ and a guitar and a violin and a flute and a drum, performing together. That's just hard to beat for genuine natural sound, or even just a string quartet. Hard to beat for genuine natural sound. And there's something to be said for just taking things from God's nature and creation and putting them together in a simple way that doesn't require an electrical outlet to perform them to God's praise. And you could argue, well, but a pipe organ needs an electrical outlet. Well, not the way that they were built in Praetorius's time. The billows were actually operated manually in his time, and there were smaller pipe organs called portatives that could be carried from place to place. And so just this idea of kind of going, not necessarily that we would be rustics, but that we would kind of go back to the basics and use the best things of God's creation to make this pure and natural sound and combine them in lovely harmonies to the glory of God. I think Praetorius would give us more than a day's thought of things to think about if he were talking to us today and looking at the music scene today.
Another application I've noticed from what you've shared about him is he saw music as not just an aid to education, but as like an education tool itself. What caused him to view music as a tool for education?
It's a great mnemonic device, isn't it? Something is much more easily remembered if you put it to music, or even if you just give it a beat or turn it into a poem or something like that. I still remember the formula for photosynthesis because I had a classmate in college who struggled with dyslexia, who turned the formula for photosynthesis into a rap. And I overheard him studying it, and I still can't get it out of my mind to this day. So, I mean, when I think about that, then I wonder if maybe some of the most underutilized hymns in our hymnal are Luther's catechetical hymns. We spend all this time teaching the Ten Commandments and in thetical statements and teaching the Lord's Prayer and teaching the Creed. Luther wrote poetical paraphrases of all of them. The Ten Commandments are the law. Our Father, who from heaven above, we all believe in one true God. And maybe there's more to be said for the use of those catechetical type hymns for helping our young people and us ourselves to remember the truths of God's word. Praetorius knew that music could aid in that endeavor, and he capitalized on that.
In your article, you also, you already mentioned today how Praetorius was working on a compendium. He's gathering all these different sources to talk about things, and also for his philosophy of music. Why do you suppose that he quotes all these ancient people who aren't in the Bible to make their points?
Well, first of all, because they're brilliant. I mean, you can't read these guys without being impressed with their learning. We, especially in our church body, the Wisconsin Synod, we all would, of course, immediately disavow the evolutionary theory. But I think that there are ways that we do unwittingly kind of swallow some of the stuff behind it in our ideas of progress, and what we're like today versus how people were like back then. And certainly there are ways in which we are more advanced today. But if you think we're more advanced, period, than people back then, just open those guys up and start reading them, and that will quickly get dismissed. There are passages in Augustine that you have to read 3 or 4 times before you even know what he's saying. And it has nothing to do with the fact that he's writing unclearly. He is writing crystal clearly. It's just that he is writing so profoundly that he is exercising parts of your heart and in your mind that you don't normally use. I know for a fact, for as much research as I try to do and as I love doing, compared to the likes of Basil the Great and Augustine and Martin Luther and Martin Chemnitz, I am dumb. That's not just false humility. That's just a fact. So to just be put in touch with intelligence like this, Praetorius sensed it too. And then too, I think there's something to this idea of the accumulated wisdom of the church. And we're a little bit leery of that, and rightly so, because if you overemphasize the accumulated wisdom of the church, you end up with the Roman Catholic Church before the Reformation. And so we disavow things like Vater Theologia, church father theology, where basically you just teach something or assume something is true because some smart Christian guy in the past said it. And we rightly disavow that. But as wrong as it is to do church father theology, it's equally as foolish to do theology without the church fathers. Because if you are coming up with some theological thought that is absolutely brand spanking new, chances are you're dead wrong, because guess what? God has been pouring out his spirit on believers of every generation since Pentecost. And so we do well to see how God's spirit was working in those early Christians, and especially the ones where it's undeniable that their intellectual gifts were just extraordinary. And so Praetorius seized on that too. That is one of the things I just love about reading any writer, not just Praetorius, but from the immediate post-Reformation period, is you're not only going to learn about their, what they've gleaned from God's word, but you're also always going to get a better instruction in the early church fathers as well.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing your thoughts. And we've kind of covered the content that we really have time for today about your article. Of course, you're drawing on the information you've had through your book project as well. But now I want to talk a little bit about the research method, and maybe more talking about the kind of the narrow focus of your article. What was that research, maybe translation method like? What did that look like?
Yeah. So since we are just talking about the article, it basically was that in the process of working on the book, Heaven is My Fatherland, I got a much better sense for where there were holes in Praetorius research or in Praetorius familiarity. And as I mentioned, one of those is definitely with the first volume of his Syntagma. And so I thought, this could be a good way to help celebrate the 400th anniversary of the Reformation, as well as talk about a subject that a lot of pastors and church musicians like to talk about, the purpose, effect, and value of choral church music. And Praetorius talks about that pretty succinctly in some of those chapters in the first volume of his Syntagma. So then it was just a matter of translating it and consulting the lexicons and grammars as necessary.
So were there some challenges in doing that research or that translation of your article?
Yeah, sure. I didn't major in music, so every so often Praetorius uses a Latin word or a Latin phrase, and you really want to make sure that you're kind of having a musical mindset as you work through it and as you translate it, so that you're putting it into the equivalent terms in modern English. So there were definitely places where you had to wrestle. I had to wrestle with that a little bit more. And then also there's just sometimes when there's a difficult Latin phrase that you need to wrestle with, or also wanting to make sure, because Praetorius likes to cite a lot of sources. He doesn't always cite them well, and he doesn't always cite them accurately. I don't know if that's because he was doing some of them from memory and his memory was failing him, or what the case was. And so just finding where those sources are in works that people can easily access today if they want to go back and look at the original context of those quotes that Praetorius is drawing on. That was a little bit difficult to do as well, but that's where Google is extremely, extremely helpful.
So as you worked through the material, did you find anything that surprised or excited you?
One thing that stands out as just something I really loved was there was a quote by Basil the Great, and it was kind of his preliminary remarks when he was commenting on Psalm 1. He has some commentary on a number of the Psalms, Basil does, and Praetorius quotes from him a couple different times, and these quotes is just good stuff. And so I actually, for this article, I actually went back to Basil the Great's original Greek and just translated that whole section fresh from the Greek and included it in an appendix to that article, because it's just got a lot of great stuff to think about there as far as choral church music goes. And just that thought of that Praetorius drew on, that thought of music being the honey to the medicine of God's word. To me, it's so simple, it's so profound, and there are any number of situations where you're thinking about or practicing church music where you can bring that idea to bear when trying to make wise decisions about church music. So I really enjoyed him bringing me into that encounter with Basil's works.
So last time you were on, we asked you about any projects that you've had. Do you have any updates on those projects or anything new?
Yeah, I think last time I talked about how I would like to pursue some sources on the Salzburg emigration of 1732, and I definitely still would like to do that. For whatever reason, when I had a lull recently, I just based on some stuff actually that I had encountered in the process of doing my Praetorius research, I started going and collecting some sources related to the centennial celebration of the presentation of the Augsburg Confession in 1630. So 100 years after 1530, when it was first presented. And one source in particular I've started to translate, called the Evangelical Jubilee Manual. Really, really fascinating work preparing Lutheran churches for celebrating the centennial and giving them some ideas for how to do that. And I kind of think maybe that could come in handy for giving some ideas for how to celebrate the 500th anniversary of the presentation of the Augsburg Confession coming up in 2030. So that's what I've been enjoying as of late.
Yeah, sounds like some more practical history projects. So awesome. And again, I already asked you before, but since you've been willing to give me your time again, I'll let you express your wishes and desires again. What would you like to see more research and writing done on within Lutheran history?
Well, for this interview, I think good just to stress that there is still research to be done on Praetorius. There are still works by Praetorius to translate, and especially anything that he originally wrote in Latin has been understudied to the present. Not to mention that if you are gifted at Latin and German, and you're gifted in music, and you could bring some of his old settings into modern English language and make them more widely available for people to sing, especially some of his simpler settings for smaller choirs, that would be an enormous service for churches today. So yeah, just I mean, people can contact me if they want a place where to begin. I can give them some leads if they want. But yeah, just there's a lot more that can be studied in Praetorius's life and work that hasn't been yet. That means learning Latin, which is maybe a good encouragement to give too. Start them young, train them up in Latin.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing your research with all of us today. We're happy to have you, and in the future, would be happy to hear from you again.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me again. It's been a pleasure as always.
All right, thank you. Now, for my listeners, if you've liked today's podcast, please like it, subscribe, share this episode with someone you might think you may find it interesting, perhaps that musical person that you know would maybe find this musical topic something that would gather their interest. If you want to find a little bit more about Praetorius, of course, you can read the book, Heaven is My Fatherland. There will be a link in the podcast description for you to check that out. Tune with us again in 15 days, and we'll have another podcast for you. Hold on. I'm back. After Pastor Biebert slept on this podcast interview, he came to the conclusion that perhaps he wanted to add a little bit something to one of his answers. When I asked him how Praetorius's ideas about worship and music are still at play today, he gave an answer in some ways directed at pastors or music and worship leaders in local congregations today. And he emailed me. He wanted to add something. He said that even though he stands by what he did say in his answer to this question, he realizes that many pastors and worship leaders have a lot more pressing and important issues on their minds and hearts right now. He doesn't want thinking about worship music and worship instruments to bring added stress to those who in some cases are already doing all they can to hold regular congregational worship in the first place as a result of the pandemic. Thanks, Pastor Biebert, for adding this note. I'm sure everyone will understand what you meant and will take it in the kindest possible way, as encouragement to do all we can. Now I'm actually going to say goodbye for today. Thank you for tuning in to the Lutheran History Podcast.